Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. For the benefit of all participants, attendee lines have been muted. Should you have any questions that you would like to submit during the event, you may submit them through the question and answer space. If we cannot address your questions during today's webinar, we will follow up after the program. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and circulated to all registrants via email after the event. Should you have follow-up questions at that time, please reach out to any of the key contacts listed in the email communication. Please note, Denton's can only issue CLE credit for attendance during the live broadcast of the webinar. Participation on the live webinar must be on a computer or laptop device. Credit is not available for joining via mobile devices. One other important note, if you have a New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas license, please be sure to listen for the code word given during the program. When prompted, you will need to enter the code word into the question and answer section of the screen. If you don't have a license in these states, you can disregard this. And now we will begin. My name is Robin Thomerson. I'm a partner with Denton's in the Lexington, Kentucky office, and my focus is compliance with the regulatory program for PFAS issued by EPA. Julia?
Thank you very much, Robin. My name is Julia Pfeil. I'm a partner in Denton's Frankfurt, Germany office, and I'm a co-head of our European service line for EU regulatory with a particular focus on chemicals, pesticides, and biocides.
Thank you, Robin and Julia. I'm Amy Rubenstein. I'm a partner in Denton's Chicago office. I've been practicing law about 22 years, 7 of which have been addressing issues related to PFAS. And I know that we're all excited to chat with you about this today, particularly in light of some of the recent EPA developments that Robin will have the privilege of discussing. First and foremost, our agenda today is why does PFAS matter to businesses? And it matters for many reasons, as I'm sure most of you on here already know. And we're going to hit these top 4 topics. What are PFAS? Where are PFAS? PFAS regulation and litigation, and trends and strategies to deal with the ever-changing regulatory and litigation landscape. Starting very briefly with a quick chemistry lesson on what are PFAS. So for those new to this term, PFAS are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They are often called forever chemicals. An easy way to remember that, if you look at the depiction on the right, those are carbon and fluorine atoms that are the large factor in a PFAS. Those are F and C. Forever chemicals are FC, so that's an easy way that I use to remember that. PFAS are very useful in many different applications because they are resistant to heat, oil, water, grease, stains. Some common applications of PFAS that we all might be aware of in our homes: DuPont's Teflon, coating on pots and pans, 3M's Scotchgard on furniture and other fabrics. But those are just some of the more than 12,000 man-made chemical compounds that fit into the PFAS category. The 2 depicted here are the most common: perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, and perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, PFOS. And you can just see that the head of that chain is what makes those 2 different. So where are these PFAS found? Here are some of the industries and products. I'm not going to sit here and read through all of these because I know that everyone is able to do that themselves. But just to give you a very broad perspective of where PFAS are found in our world, these are some of the broad categories of places that may have PFAS. And there's a lot of things on here that I think people don't really think about, like your cell phone and paint that's in our house and various different parts in our cars. In the safety and military application, the Department of Defense is a huge purchaser of PFAS-containing products, notably aqueous film forming foam, which is a necessary firefighting foam used to, I'm blanking on the word when you put out a fire. So we'll just say to put out a fire, to put out really awful fires. It has the ability to shut those fires down very quickly. And at this point, the Department of Defense is estimating that future PFAS investigation and cleanup costs from these uses will total more than $2.1 billion beginning in fiscal year 2022 alone. And that's in addition to an already spent $1.1 billion that were incurred in PFAS-related costs through 2021. If you read any of the government's publications on this and putting numbers to this, they're very quick to say that these costs are rising, that the estimates are expected to increase and the like. Maybe these numbers don't take people's breath away, but when I see them, they're really kind of shocking in light of other budgetary concerns. But then you see that PFAS contamination is likely at 58,000 sites. Many of these sites are military sites where Department of Defense used PFAS in military training and other fire protective uses. Airports, same thing, using a lot of PFAS in any sort of fuel spills, fires related to that, wastewater treatment plants where PFAS is being processed, and industrial facilities that are one of the many uses where PFAS can be made or used in productions. This is a rough depiction of the PFAS life cycle, just to give an idea of the multiple entrance points into the environment, into human exposure pathways for PFAS. It can start through industry going to products to people. It can start through industry going to the environment, being picked up in the weather. Many lakes, rainwater, etc., are found to have PFAS in it, and it's very hard to say exactly where it's all coming from, but this is a rough depiction of how it gets there. Robin?
Thank you, Amy. As I said earlier, my focus is on regulatory compliance and assisting companies with complying with the various EPA rules that have been proposed and are now being finalized. And what is a current focus for industry at this time are various reporting requirements that EPA is imposing, and they have been very active in finalizing those rules since the fall. So one question is why there is a concern about PFAS. PFAS, as you know, is called forever chemicals, and therefore it has a persistence in the environment, which has been a concern for regulatory agencies. Bioaccumulation in fish and mammals, as well as toxicity through soil and drinking water, have been concerns. From the industry perspective, PFAS can be placed into the environment via air emissions, stormwater, and of course, accidental releases into the environment. The primary concern for PFAS has always been PFAS in drinking water. And that is the first rule that EPA has finalized on April 10th, 2024. On that day, they pre-published the final rule for national primary drinking water standards for certain PFAS. That rule has not yet appeared in the Federal Register, so it is not final at this point, but when it does become published in the Federal Register, it will be effective 60 days after publication. This rule will be primarily indicated at water utility districts. They will have to now meet requirements of drinking water only at a level of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS, and then for PFNA, PFX S and GenX chemicals, it will be at 10 parts per million with a health-based non-enforceable goal of 10 parts per trillion. The hazard index level for 2 or more of the above referenced PFAS will be considered as a mixture. If you're familiar with CERCLA implementation, a hazardous index level is what EPA uses to typically look at mixtures of chemicals and see what those mixtures impacts will be on human health. And so it is going to, for the first time, utilize a hazardous index for drinking water, where it has normally been used for soils at Superfund sites, which is going to be very interesting. And that is one of the questions that will likely come up in litigation that is brought against this regulation once it has become final. I'm sorry. My clicker went too fast. So the initial reactions and concern of many, including the utilities, but also industry sectors, policymakers, and environmental groups is, there is a large upstream cost to industry where utilities may seek contribution from industrial sources to meet these obligations. It's anticipated that the cost of water is going to rise. The implementation of this hazardous index approach is questionable. No one is quite sure how it's going to work. There are many questions about the underlying science that goes into these extremely low levels, which are very close to zero. And also the speed of the regulatory process. One of the major concerns that people have had with the PFAS process has been that typically you get all of the science related to what the hazards are to human health and the environment prior to rulemaking. And here we have developing science where we have not had a good definite impact on human health or impact on the environment. This is a concern because utilities are not going to have adequate funds to meet these extremely low limits. And even though there have been federal infrastructure dollars allocated, those dollars are not going to be enough. The National Association of Manufacturers have publicly said that they are going to be looking at possible ways to revoke this rule, in addition to considering litigation on the rule. All of these concerns will be issues that we will see in litigation as this promulgation progresses. To give you an idea of the levels that we are looking at for these rules, 1 part per trillion is the equivalent to a single eye drop of water in not 1, but 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we are dealing with levels that are extremely low. The detection limits are difficult, and you see both laboratories and testing companies really striving to catch up with these extremely low limits, because right now, we have never seen anything this low. As you may have heard, on Friday, EPA issued a pre-publication form of their final rule designating PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substances under CERCLA. What does that mean for industry? What EPA has said in their proposed rule was that this designation had only reporting requirements. And so when they justified the rule and the regulatory impact analysis, they looked at only what the reporting cost would be, because they said that this was just a reporting rule and would not be necessarily a remediation rule. So what is the reporting portion of the rule? For any industry that has a release of more than 1 pound of PFOA or PFAS in any 24-hour period, so it's a rolling 24-hour period, it will need to be reported to federal, state, and/or tribal agencies. Certain requirements are also put in place for federal facilities when they transfer property on what they have to notify the purchaser of. But for the most part, what EPA has said is that this is a reporting rule. That's what it says in the rule itself. However, along with this rule, they issued a guidance document for regions. The headquarters issued a guidance document for regions on enforcement of the rule, and they made it quite clear that they are going to use all of the CERCLA avenues for enforcing against those industries that manufacture or use PFOS or PFOA in their manufacturing process and significantly contribute to PFOA or PFAS in the environment. If you are familiar at all with CERCLA, it is a very unforgiving, strict liability, broad bat law that brings into account any potentially responsible party and has broad requirements for investigation and remediation of property. They have also issued, as of January 12th, they solicited, 2023, they solicited public comment on their national enforcement and compliance initiatives. And they, in August of last year, announced their priorities in regard to PFAS. They fully intend to use CERCLA against manufacturers and users of PFAS in their operational process. They have in both documents, both the guidance document of Friday and the National Enforcement and Compliance Initiative, said that they will give exceptions for passive receivers, such as publicly owned landfills, public water utilities, public airports, and local and state fire departments, as well as farms who have accepted biosolids as a fertilizer for their crops. However, they also clearly state that those are exceptions that are guidance only, and that where they see necessary, they will utilize CERCLA authority to take whatever action that they deem necessary. So we're looking at some very broad implications. And I'm going to go on to those, and I'll come back to the hazardous waste in just a second. So the possible impacts that we're going to see from this hazardous substance designation is widened scope of environmental due diligence for transactions, At this time, the ASTM guidance document for due diligence suggests that PFAS be examined as you're talking about transfer of property and due diligence and purchasing property. Reporting requirements, as we've discussed, if you have a release of PFOA or PFAS in excess of 1 pound in a 24-hour period, it has to be reported. Potentially expansive indication of your PRPs, state cleanup requirements, and the possibility of reopening or continuation of ongoing remediation that it now includes PFAS or PFOA. Identification of new sites based on historical PFAS releases. All of these things are potentially possible with the CERCLA designation. And so it has the potential to have vast impacts on how we do business, how we clean up sites. Landfills are already refusing to take any PFAS contaminated material. So it is going to make things very difficult as we move forward, and I foresee a number of implementation issues. Add to that EPA has proposed 2 regulations under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act for hazardous waste, where they have identified 9 PFAS to the list of hazardous constituents. That comment period has ended, and we may see a rule probably this year, because the Biden administration is intently making the effort to get as many rules finalized as possible this year. Another rule that has wide-ranging impacts for industry is the final rule modifying toxic release inventory reporting for PFAS. If you are used to doing TRI reporting, you will know that the reporting year is for instance, 2024. Your reports will be due in July of 2025. And this final rule was released in October and is final at this point. We have no more de minimis exemptions for PFAS materials. So even if you have a chemical mixture with less than 1% PFAS in it and 0.1% for PFOA, you must include it in the toxic release inventory. No more ranges. If you had reported a range, that is no longer allowed. There is no more simplified reporting for PFAS constituents. And suppliers are now required to include in their MSDS sheets mixtures with less than 1% of PFAS. This is something that many companies are looking at now. They are trying to get a handle on this now, because you need to be ready to report that in July of 2025. Along with that rule, we had a new rule for TSCA reporting, and this is a longer reporting, a one-time longer reporting period that goes from 2011 through 2023. Again, this is no more de minimis exemptions. They want to know every PFAS element that your company has used. It includes articles, impurities, byproducts, and further assessment of whether a person imported articles or coincidentally produced byproducts is required. You are required to do a due diligence assessment and report any information that is known or reasonably ascertainable. There are streamlined article import forms or the standard reporting forms. EPA in their narrative made that look like it was going to be an easy thing to produce and look at, and it is not. If you have not already begun to look at what you will be required to report on May 8th of 2025, it would be very advisable for you to do that. What we have done here at Denton's is we work with a nationally recognized consultant firm and get a plan in place for our clients so that they can go out and look at their supply chain and know exactly what they are looking at. So if you are in New York, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania, please type the CLE code in the Q&A box now at the right side of your screen. If you cannot find it, click on the More button and select Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thanks, Robin. The word puzzle really applies here, as you all just heard Robin talk about the various EPA regulations from water to CERCLA to TSCA that are applying to PFAS. Each state is also doing its own thing when it comes to PFAS, and you can see here that 36 out of 50 states have either introduced and adopted legislation relating to PFAS. And these regulations cover virtually every product category. And they can be very prohibitive in terms of not being able to sell products containing various PFAS, or they have limits like 100 parts per million of total organic fluorine. And I'll put a pin in the treatment of total organic fluorine as a proxy for PFAS, because that could be a whole another hour-long webinar about whether that is or is not. But the point is that the legislation that we're seeing in the various states is yet another place that businesses need to look to see if what they're making and selling or distributing, because the regulations can apply to any one of those categories, has PFAS in it, and if so, what they need to do about it and what levels are permissible. This is certainly something that many of our clients have been talking to us a lot about, and I think it's pretty safe to say that if you are selling a product nationwide in the US, that at some point in your supply chain, there's probably something containing PFAS that you should be thinking of. Doesn't mean you need to stop selling it. Maybe, you're within some exception, or maybe you're, in a state that you're selling where the legislation doesn't take effect until 2026, but it's certainly something that needs to be on a compliance radar for folks to be thinking of. And the consequences that we're seeing in terms of non-compliance are really existential threat type of litigation. The biggest litigation right now involving PFAS is the firefighting foam, the aqueous film forming foam litigation that's going on in South Carolina in front of Judge Gergel. There have been many settlements reached in those cases, which we'll get to in a moment, but there are upwards of, at this point, probably close to 10,000 PFAS-related lawsuits that have been filed. And it's really remarkable how expensive they are. Even the judge overseeing the litigation in the District of South Carolina, Judge Gergel, said it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if certain motions don't go in the defense's favor, they're an existential threat to their survival. And I don't know how he knows what each one of these companies views as an existential threat, but that's a pretty broad statement. And there's a lot of truth to that, especially when you see the amount that's being paid here. So several major PFAS settlements from drinking water contamination alone. This is not talking about other product suits that we've seen related to personal care products or pharmaceuticals. This is just drinking water contamination. New Jersey settled with a manufacturer for $393.8 million. 3 firms settled to resolve claims for the aqueous film forming foam at almost $1.2 billion. And 1 PFAS manufacturer settled to cover up to $12.5 billion in costs associated with monitoring, remediating, treating, etc., PFAS in drinking water in allegedly impacted communities. And when you look at this, plus what I was talking about earlier with respect to DoD's estimated cleanup costs, other costs with CERCLA and TSCA, this is certainly a very expensive problem. And I don't want to be dramatic about it. I really feel like we have not even seen the tip of the iceberg as to how expensive this is going to be and how this is going to run over the next several decades. Julia?
Yes, thank you very much, Amy. Turning to PFAS concerns in the EU, and as you will see in a moment, they are somewhat similar, but the focus in the EU is very different. Currently, the primary focus of the discussions in the EU when it comes to PFAS is an EU proposal to restrict, meaning prohibit, all PFAS substances in the EU. And we're talking about all PFAS substances. We're going to see that in a moment in a bit more detail. We are really talking about 10,000 plus substances. Only a few exceptions would remain, many of those time limited with a phase-out period, either 6.5 or 30.5 years. And the ban would be implemented under the EU REACH regulation in the form of an amendment. Again, I'm going to discuss this proposal a bit more in a few moments. What we have in the EU as well, and this goes very much to what Amy just discussed, we do have contaminated sites, sites contaminated with PFAS. The focus is on possible contamination of water, not so much on drinking water. But we currently do not see real media attention on dealing with contamination of PFAS because everything is really on the proposal to restrict the PFAS. What happens to contaminated sites? These sites are being managed in line with existing EU legislation, mainly the Environmental Liability Directive, as implemented in the various member states. In some member states, that means companies are only responsible for non-historic contaminations. So in those cases, the costs fall with the government. In other cases, like in Germany, companies who either own or cause the contamination will be responsible for remediation. But what we see is nowhere near the amounts that Amy has just presented. And it's really more of a concern that's not really at the forefront of media attention. What does get a lot of attention is the proposal to restrict PFAS. The main driver of this proposal at present is an authority with the wonderful name of ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency. And at the moment, we are in a phase where the proposal is being reviewed by 2 committees, the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socioeconomic Assessment Committee. What you can see here is a broad overview of the process, what has happened so far, what has been planned, and all those plans have simply gone up in the air because this proposal is just simply too massive. It's by far the largest thing this authority has ever done, has ever dealt with. You can see here it all started in we can't see it, it did start in 2022 actually, but usually this process starts with a dossier, a restriction dossier. That dossier is prepared by 1 or several EU member states, in the case at hand 5 EU member states. Then it goes through various levels of public consultations. And the final outcome will then be an updated report setting out the proposed restrictions and prohibitions. So as you can see on the slide, we had the consultation ended last year in 25 September Q3, and what you can see then, the original plan was to have those committees discuss and give their final reports by Q2 2024. That is not going to happen, simply because there's far too many comments that have been received by ECHA. I think more than 6,000 comments were received. And now someone at the authority needs to read through all that, and a comment could easily be 100 pages or several hundred pages. So that's one comment times 6,500. So can imagine what amount of paper, hopefully no one ever printed it, they're dealing with. So the latest development is a press release by ECHA of 13 March, and you can see that the two committees, Risk Assessment Committee, Socioeconomic Assessment Committee, they will hold meetings until September 2024 to prepare their final reports. And then there's a second consultation period where the public, meaning any individual, any company, any industry association, can submit additional comments to the report by the Socioeconomic Assessment Committee. This is all happening at the authority, ECHA. ECHA will then prepare a final report. This report will then be presented to the European Commission, and the European Commission, in theory, has 3 months to come up with a legislative proposal. If we look at the timeline, what has already happened, I think there's no way they'll be able to complete that within 3 months. But it's actually up to the Commission to draft the main legislative proposal. The proposal will then be presented to the member states and the European Parliament, who can review it, scrutinize it. But, and this is important to understand, neither the Parliament nor the member states can actually demand changes to the proposal. They can only say yes or no to the whole thing. And so it's going to be either adopted in total or rejected in total. And the likelihood, considering the amount of energy that has already gone into this, the likelihood that it will be rejected in the very end, in my view, in my experience, is very, very small. So we'll definitely see something that might be quite broad, might be quite small. There's conflicting reports in the media, what's happening at ECHA right now, because as you can imagine, industry opposition to this proposal is really, really strong. Looking at some of the some more details of the regulatory process, if this slide ever moves along. Here, I'm not going to read through all of this. What I would highlight is where it says opportunity at the bottom line of each of these, well, not each of them, but the ones that are still interesting, those boxes, because that tells you that if you do want to get engaged, because it concerns you, because you're selling PFAS or products containing PFAS, manufacturing PFAS in the European Union, this is your chance to get engaged, get involved. The review that started on 22nd March of last year, that's already been completed. At the moment, we have Q3 to Q9, we have review by the two committees. And basically, this is mostly a lobbying exercise or advocacy exercise. So can try to influence the committees, can try to put some influence on ECHA. The next portion, the next step in the proposal will be the, like I mentioned before, the legislative proposal to be prepared by the Commission. And there again, you have one department of the Commission being responsible. And here again, the opportunity is not so much submitting comments, but rather advocacy at country levels in order to try and get governments to influence it and get governments and industry associations to note their opposition, or if you're in favor of it, issue and propose or announce their support of the measure. Then possibly in 2025, possibly later, the Commission will come up with its draft. It will be presented to the European Council, which are the European member states, and it will go to the European Parliament. And there, as I mentioned before, the whole thing can only be rejected or approved in full. And as I mentioned before, it's most likely that this will be, how to say, at that stage, it's most likely impossible to stop. So if it reaches that stage, it's most likely that member states and parliament will simply wave it through, simply because so much enormous effort has already, by that time, will have gone into the proposal, will have gone into the restriction. So what exactly is the content of the proposal, of the process? The dossier, which is generally a report, was published on 22nd March 2023. It was submitted by the competent authorities of 5 member states. The lead authority is something called BAUA from Germany. They're actually responsible for workplace health and workplace safety. And you can see it's also been supported by the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. As to the content, the substance is identified by name, and you can see here that it actually means all PFAS. And the member states, European member states, have chosen to use the definition given by the OECD in 2021. And just a very few substances, few fully degradable PFAS subgroups have been excluded from the proposal. They are not persistent. And you can see here, depending on the various types of the concentration thresholds that would still be allowed in products after the implementation, you can see here that they are very, very low, 25 parts per billion for individual substances. It's not as low as the level, the 20 Olympic swimming pools that we saw before, but this isn't much. So this is basically, the idea is to have something that's as close to the level of that can possibly be shown with scientific methods. So they basically want a full ban, and this is just, you know, to allow for insecurities at measurement and insecurities when trying to prove whether or not PFAS are present. And again, it's going to be covered, all PFAS is going to be covered, and you can see here the scope of prohibitions. The prohibition is going to be manufacturing, using, or placing on the market. That includes import into the EU as substances on their own, in another substance, as a constituent, in a mixture, or in an article. So this is as broad as it ever gets under the EU REACH regulation. It actually means a total ban of PFAS in the EU, either for import or for manufacturing in the EU. The restriction is, again, a general ban. There's going to be an 18-month transition period from entry into force, and then you have derogations with the length of either 5 years or 12 years. So that total adds up to if you add the entry into force period, adds up to 6.5 or 13.5 years, depending on the derogation that you have. A few more words on derogations, because these will be really, really important, because this is sort of all that's left for PFAS users. We have a few exclusions. Few means 3. And they are, as you can see here, for PFAS used as active substances in plant protection products, biocidal products, or human veterinary medicinal products. So that's going to be where PFAS will be allowed in the future in the EU. But they are not completely unregulated, because the exclusion is here because these substances, or no, these uses have already been addressed under other EU regulations. So that's an exclusion. The PFAS ban under REACH will not apply to these substances at all. For everything else, there is the possibility to obtain a so-called derogation, but there again, the member states have suggested only very few derogations. You can see here what the precondition is in order to get a 5-year derogation or 12-year derogation. And even where there is a derogation for a particular use of a particular substance, there's additional biannual reporting obligations for the derogated uses. In the comment period, we know from experience that many companies, industry associations have argued for additional exclusions and additional derogations, some of them very broad, because the scope of what the member states have suggested is generally perceived by industry, not so much by environmental NGOs, as being very, very narrow and as being really an obstacle to future industrial development in the EU, because some very important uses of substances, very important substances that cannot be replaced or substituted, despite what the member states say, have been included in the total ban. What are the main issues, the main regulatory problems? I mentioned before, the restriction proposal could include 10,000 plus substances. That is an absurdly large amount. In particular, when one looks at REACH, and REACH actually requires, the REACH regulation requires a substance by substance review for adoption of restrictions. That is something that has absolutely not happened here. The regulation does allow for grouping of substances, but that is only possible under very narrow circumstances when you have when the substances that you do want to group are comparable in their chemical composition, in their effects, in their main environmental impacts. And that is certainly not the case for these 10,000 plus substances. So it's going to be interesting to see. The regulation, once adopted, most certainly someone's going to start litigation against this. And these are certainly issues that will later have to be decided by the European Court of Justice. Also, the derogations, so the suggestions for the derogations, the basis, the scientific basis and the legal basis that are underlying the derogations, they follow a concept of essential uses. So if something is an essential use and you have a socio-economic consideration with it, then you can get a derogation. The problem is this concept of essential uses isn't included in the REACH regulation. There's a plan to include it in the REACH regulation in the future. So whenever the REACH update that has been, is moving through the processes somewhere is adopted, it's possible to include derogations for essential uses. At the moment, that is not possible. So the interesting question from a legal point will be, how will the European Court of Justice deal with this? When you have a basis that is, actually it's excluding more derogations, you have a basis that is not in the law at the moment when the restriction is adopted, but will be or might be in the law when the court's going to decide on that. I must say, for me, it's going to be interesting because I do not really know what the court is going to make of this. And also importantly, the proposal does not take sufficient account of existing restrictions for some PFAS. So we already heard PFOAS are the most important group of PFAS. And there's a particular regulation, for example, in particular for these substances, under the so-called F-gas regulation in the EU. Now, the F-gas regulation does not propose a complete ban, but the F-gas regulation uses an approach where we're looking at a phase-out period, where we have, for example, limits or certain amounts that can be imported, and then you can trade with the amounts and can exchange the amounts. So it's a completely different regulatory concept from what will be in this ban under the REACH regulation. And there again, this is also, I think, a major problem with the regulation that also has to be addressed by the European Court of Justice later. And with that, I move back to Amy.
Thank you, Julia, for that important overview on what's going on in the EU. And in addition to what Robin and I discussed happening in the United States on both the federal and the state level, there's a lot of activity in the EU. There's also activity in Canada, Mexico, various different Asian countries as well. So PFAS is not a concern that can just be looked at in a micro level. It really has to be looked at on a macro level for businesses, because we are in a global economy, and each country, in addition to various different states within various different countries, are doing different things. So at this point, we want to talk about some of the trends and strategies for dealing with PFAS in businesses. And I'm going to get started, but Robin and Julia should feel free to pop in here. They have vast experience that can be really helpful in contributing to whatever I'm going to say. So in thinking about how to address and look at PFAS for a business, one of the first things to do, and really not just saying this because we are lawyers, but get counsel involved. Given what we are seeing in terms of litigation, and this covers a multitude of industries, really thinking as you're looking at a potential PFAS concern as everything that I am doing here could be discoverable. How do I want this to look if this was on the front page of a major newspaper, if this was being presented to a jury, or, just out there in the world? So I would first recommend starting with competent counsel who know PFAS and understand very clearly that you want whatever you are doing to be able to be protected and privileged to the fullest extent possible. So anything done in a sort of PFAS protective strategy should consider litigation, discovery, and privilege issues right at the get-go. And that also means, for example, in various different jurisdictions, how does your legal privilege apply? Again, that's like a whole nother 5-hour-long seminar that we could be doing. But, in Illinois, for example, where I sit, there's one test for privilege, the control group test. In other states, there's different tests. In other countries, there's different tests. So thinking about how do we protect privilege? Then looking at, a baseline study. What are the PFAS risks that could impact the business? Is there any possibility that we are dealing with PFAS in our environment, in our production, in our inputs, in our outputs? How is PFAS potentially impacting our world? Is the property that we're sitting on PFAS contaminated? Is the water that our employees have access to PFAS contaminated? Hint, most likely, if you're in the United States drawing from any water source, it probably is. So looking at this on a holistic basis, starting with what are the baseline PFAS issues that my business might face. And I forgot to advance the slides, but just for fun, we'll do so now. Before I move on, Rob and Julia, anything to add before supply chain analysis?
The baseline study is something that everyone should do to determine whether or not they have TSCA or TRI regulatory implications. And just, the 3 words I have on those 2 regulatory obligations is document, document, document. You want to make sure that you have something in your files that indicate that you have done your due diligence, and that your due diligence hopefully shows that you have no obligations under either of those reporting requirements, but you have to have that documentation to show that that due diligence requirement has been met. And again, to reiterate what Amy just said, looking at protecting that analysis, even from a regulatory standpoint, you want to look at protecting that analysis, not only for the regulatory purpose, because of course anything that you submit to a regulatory agency is going to be considered open records, but you want to protect the process, and you want to be sure that it is protected from a third-party litigation standpoint.
I mean, in the EU, in certain cases, you are actually required under legal obligation to prepare a baseline study. That happens when you ask for significant, it's not the legal term, but in practice, it's when you ask for significant, for permit for significant amendments to certain industrial facilities. And so you may already have baseline studies for your sites that you're using, properties that you're using. However, PFAS is a relatively new concern. So studies that are older than say 10 or 15 or even 20 years might not have information on PFAS in them, even though the property could be contaminated, because a few years back, people weren't really prepared to look for PFAS. That at least accounts for some of the, some studies that I have seen. So if you have older studies that do not show PFAS presence, that may not actually be accurate.
I'm recognizing that we only have 3 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to talk a little faster here. Moving next to a supply chain analysis. Now, is your company receiving raw materials or component parts that contain PFAS? Things, for example, that you might not even be thinking of, like if you're using leather in various different goods, even if the leather hasn't been treated with something containing PFAS, cows are in fields drinking water and eating green material that contains PFAS. So you could end up having PFAS contamination that you're not even thinking about. Is your manufacturing process in some way using PFAS or generating PFAS as an output? Do the products that you're making during their degradation process, what I call kind of like shape shift into a PFAS? Maybe they didn't start out that way, but through various different chemical and biodegradation processes could they end up there? So thinking about those components, you know, we've seen many clients that are getting asked questions like, do you have PFAS in, you know, your inputs or outputs if they're a supplier or distributor? And these are tough questions to answer, but they're important ones. I'm going to go real fast now because we got 1 more minute. Sorry, colleagues. Indemnity agreements. To the extent that a business is able to, asking in sales agreements and purchase agreements, seeking indemnification for any PFAS related liability that might arise. A lot of agreements right now, it's unclear where that burden falls. And so thinking about for future agreements, carving that out. Another thing we've seen companies do if they believe that they have a large PFAS liability is to create separate entities to hold different structures. Of course, we don't want to engage in any sort of fraudulent activity, and certainly companies are being accused of doing so. But this is an area where it might be possible to contain PFAS liability. And then lastly, through insurance and reinsurance, before 2023, ISO insurance forms did not exclude PFAS. Now those forms do. And with respect to insurance coverage, some PFAS liabilities could date back to the 1940s or 50s when these chemicals were first being introduced. And so historical insurance could be really important if you ever find yourself in the position where you need to call upon it, being aware of what your insurance programs were from up to 100 years ago. We are totally out of time. I'm going to toss it back to my colleagues if they have any closing remarks, and I'm going to be quiet.
No, I think from the EU point of view, that covers basically all the concerns that you would also need to think about when dealing with EU companies, EU properties.
I agree. Thank you all for participating in today's CLE webinar.